looking at how their building expressed itself in its context. And the idea of context became very important. Context not only geographically, but also historically, maybe with references to past events or past architectural styles, but also to important things happening here and now, or in the era in which the building was built. And this idea of contextualism, I'd argue, continues today, and in particular, some of the context architects today grapple with involve energy, zero-sum energy towers, and lead buildings, leadership and energy and environmental design. So all these types of influences, even today, encourage architects to think about context. And in the 1980s, the context, of course, was a re-exploration, often exaggerated, of former historical styles. Buildings became shapelier, they became built out of stone once again, they took on exaggerated historical qualities, and some of this even survives today with references that architects still make. So now, as we cruise along here, we're going to get a wonderful view of the north end of Chicago's Loop, filled with skyscrapers, and we're going to be able to see and think about what it was the architects may have been thinking about as they designed these particular buildings. Now, as you look, for example, at the three buildings that we went by already, all designed by the same group of architects, Kohn Pedersen Fox in New York. The first one we went by, look at how it sits in the street wall of Wacker Drive, picking up the color, the cornice lines, the Chicago Bridge on the very top of it, the urn-like elements, very Prairie School. That building is anchored to the Chicago River, proclaims itself as being a part of the Chicago River tradition with its little bridge-like feature at the very top. The one in the center, much more sculptural in quality. It's like a diva on center stage. It really commands attention on this historic and famous site here, the curving site of Wacker Drive at the juncture of the two branches of the Chicago River. Always prominent and yet contextual in the sense of its coloration and its nod to other historic buildings in the district with its granite columns, etc. And the newest one of the three, Kohn Pedersen Fox, the dark blue one with the lantern-like light on the top of it. Dark color set back on the grid of the city streets, blending a little bit more into the background, in fact blending in with its neighboring building there, allowing the one in the middle to really remain the sculptural diva on center stage of the suite of three buildings. So three very different looking buildings, but contextual in their own way, all designed by the same architects. And it's pretty wonderful. All right, as we go under Lake Street Bridge here, we'll be entering the Loop proper of Chicago. The Loop gets its name from the loop that our L trains make through the central district of Chicago, which has always been the commercial downtown. There's bits and pieces of old Chicago here too. For example, on your left, another old warehouse building from 1908 that was converted in the 80s into office space by Shipwright and Heinrich. Also on the left here, the building that has the Starbucks coffee logo. This building's from the 1970s, Joel Hillman, the architect, and this is characteristic of the attitude the 1970s had to the river. Now, I'm not knocking Joel Hillman. This is a very interesting building in terms of its structure and so on, but developers, the city, the architects, the general public, no one thought of the river as an amenity, so they didn't pay any attention to it. They didn't allow for space for a nice patio there for Starbucks or a little park or anything. That was just the attitude people had to the river. Now, I'm not going to pull any punches here. The river smelled really bad. It was really polluted. We had lots of pollution flowing into this river for a long, long time, and it wasn't pleasant to be on the river. You would dream of spending time along the banks of the river back in the 60s and 70s. It was very polluted. It's much cleaner today. It still is polluted, but it's cleaner. So, 1950s here on the left, another example of turning its back on the river. This is the General Growth Properties headquarters building. Graham Anderson, Probst and White design from the late 1950s. Another lost opportunity to even put a river walk here. Coming up on the left, one of these sort of grand dames of downtown Chicago. This is the Civic Opera House building. Another Graham Anderson, Probst and White design. It's a little hard to see from our location on the river, but looking up at it, you actually have that throne-like, setback-like shape characteristic of Art Deco, and if you look at the towers themselves, they have a little bit of that Art Deco expression. And again, this is a transitional building. This is from 1929. It's now home to our Lyric Opera, and of course behind this big blank wall is where the theater is, obviously, and then the office towers around it. The decorative motifs here are classical, relating to classical theater designs, but again, 1930, it's a 1929, 1930, it's a little transitional. If you look at the exaggerated geometrical styling of these classical details, you can see a little influence of that Art Deco aesthetic creeping in even to the cornice patterns there with the chevrons. That building was developed by a man named Samuel Insull, who was a secretary to Thomas Edison, and Insull founded Commonwealth Edison, the big utilities company here in the Midwest, and he lost all his money developing that building because of the crash, the 1929 economic crash. Also on your left, another building that was taking advantage of the downtown commercial area. This used to be the home of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and in the center area here was the exchange itself, flanked by two towers for trading companies designed by Fujikawa Johnson in the 80s. The MERC has now merged with the Chicago Board of Trade and centralized their locations at the Board of Trade building, so this is now just an office building, but makes a little bit of use of its river location. You can hear the train activity here on your right-hand side. When the railroads all centralized into what is now our Amtrak terminal about 2 blocks to the west here, this made it very difficult to economically develop this part of town. In the 1960s, the city finally decked over all the railroad tracks and began to develop this area. And one of the examples of that early development is here on your right-hand